Old Norse texts for Nildislag spells, berserkers and skalds in the House of Revels.
Hello and welcome back to House of Revels, the Theatre Through the Ages podcast. I'm Olivia.
And I'm Mingma.
And we are theatre practitioners taking you on a journey through the history of theatre in Britain from naught to now.
Each episode we discuss a different theatre style, its context, origin and form, and then we score said theatre style in 4 different categories. Finally, we decide whether this style deserves to join the illustrious House of Revels, the great and noble hall where only the best of British theatre lives.
This week, it is episode 4, and we are looking at
Viking storytelling.
Ooh! Mingma, why are we looking at Viking storytelling if we're doing a podcast set in Britain?
Well, Liv, did you know there was a Viking king of England?
No, I did not, Mingma.
In fact, at one point Wessex, which was the kingdom of Alfred the Great, was the heart of a North Sea empire, led by a king called Canute.
Ooh, is Canute the guy who kind of went into the sea and was like, I am the king and I am powerful?
Yeah, yes, he is. God, history's cruel, isn't it? You know, you do one thing and then everything gets misinterpreted. He is the guy who's known for being the idiotic king who thought he could keep the sea from coming in.
Oh.
There is a different retelling of that story, which is that he did it to prove to his sycophantic advisors that he was not as all-powerful as they were all trying to prove to him.
Oh, I see. So he was kind of like, well, he knew that he wasn't going to be able to stop the sea. He was like, well, I'll show you, but also I'll embarrass myself in the process.
Yeah, pretty much.
I like this guy.
Yeah.
He's kind of taking one for the team.
Yeah, you could almost say he's the Great, Liv.
Oh, could you, Mingma? Could you?
Oh yes, you could, because in the rest of Scandinavia, he is known as Canute the Great.
Ah, so if he was Scandinavian, maybe you could say he was the Great. I don't know how I was going with that.
I don't know.
That made sense.
No, I think it's a great. It's just hilarious that our one kind of really good Viking king, all of Scandinavia, all of Northern Europe know him as this amazing guy who has the title of the Great, and we know him as the bloke who thought he could stop the sea from coming in.
That bloke who got a bit damp. The damp guy.
The damp guy.
He's got wet shoes.
Anyway, we're going to talk about him in a later episode, but this is a little kind of preview.
Exciting. So keep listening is the takeaway point.
For now, all we need to know is that the Vikings raided Lindisfarne in 793, and Canute became king in 1016. So, for 223, mostly unknown years in British psyche, the Vikings and Viking culture lived and settled in Britain.
So that is why we're doing a Vikings episode then. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about context. So this is the part of the podcast where we discuss the current day events. So as this theatre style form developed, what else was going on in history? What economic, social, political movements might affect performance?
So this is an interesting one where we should start by saying that calling it Viking storytelling is a bit of a misnomer.
Oh, no.
Yeah, one of those fun ones where, you know, all the stuff we were told at school was wrong, fun. There's very little evidence the men, women and children who came from the north ever called themselves Vikings as this kind of populous group. But, you know, I'm a sucker for clickbait, so here we are.
You could almost say that you're a bit of a whore for clickbait, because House of Revels, HOR.
Oh, God.
I mean, we walked into this one, Mingma, when we decided to do something with the initials HOR, and I feel like it does need mentioning.
Yeah, to be fair.
I mean, we talk about women, so we're very feminist. I mean, we are women.
You know, feminist the hill. You know, we're reclaiming it. Put it that way.
We're reclaiming it. We're House of Revels now, so...
What can we say?
What can we say? Viking storytelling isn't really Viking storytelling. It's more like storytelling of some people from Scandinavia.
When we think about the Viking Age, in kind of in modern history now. It's a real kind of generalist looking back at a grouping of events. I mean, we do this a lot. We look at them and go, oh, well, that all makes a nice little storytelling bubble. They clearly knew they were in the middle of something which would end like this. And look at us right now, to be honest, actually.
Yeah,
it's probably quite
will we be called? What will we be called? The Trump era? The disastrous 21st century? The
pandemic that wiped out the world.
The pandemic. The regression era.
Oh God, let's not
hypothesize of what we're going to be called in 1,000 years' time.
So the basic point is that we have this grouping of people and events who actually had no national affinity to each other, and nor were they even all from Scandinavia. The modern use of the term Viking actually started in the 19th century by poets like Walter Scott. Got to blame the poets for everything, don't we?
Poets always come back. You can never leave poets behind.
The term Viking, however, does come from Old Norse, and it seems to have two meanings in that language. So Vikingur, with an R very prominently on the end, was someone who went on expeditions. And Vikinga, AR on the end, was the plural of everyone in the group who was going on the expedition. However, by kind of the 13th, 14th century, the Icelandic sagas are using Vikingur to describe piracy and theft. And I would posit that this is because by this time, most Northmen had settled in new lands, so the culture of raiding no longer existed. So, like, at the time, hey, this is just what we do. But looking back, it's...
not anymore. No. Not anymore, chaps. We're different now. We've changed.
Yeah. We're different, lads. With all of this being said, I'm going to keep on calling it Viking storytelling because it's easier.
Right. So, Viking storytelling then it is. Onwards and upwards.
Onwards and upwards. So, a whistle-stop tour through history. In 793, Vikings raided Lindisfarne Monastery. Lindisfarne is the island in the North Sea where St. Cuthbert landed, and he was really the person who was celebrated as bringing Christianity to Britain. A monastery was founded there, and this monastery was raided, burned, and pillaged by Vikings. And so it sent shockwaves throughout England the moment that this happened, all 7 kingdoms of England, that these Norsemen had dared to go to somewhere quite so sacred. Before then, there'd been a couple of skirmishes, but this was like the real moment when we've landed, boys. It was the kind of the big old message. There were 2 Viking ages. The second Viking age we'll talk about more in the next episode. But the first one is the one which Alfred the Great is at the heart of it. So the Vikings raided Lindisfarne, and from that it was like this enormous wave of raids coming down and down and down, and they were and all the kingdoms of England were falling. Northumbria, Mercia, I can't remember all of them, whoops. And finally it got to Wessex. And the Vikings got incredibly close to taking the entirety of England then. Alfred was initially defeated, and then he went into the marshes, and he burnt some cakes.
He burnt some cakes? Sorry, let's read.
You know the story of Alfred.
I don't remember anyone burning. Did he actually burn them on a fire, or did he just put them in the oven for too long and burnt them by accident?
So the idea is that he was in disguise. Poor farmer was hiding Alfred in his cottage, and he hadn't told his wife who this guy was. So his wife was going, you fucking layabout, what are you doing in my house? And you aren't even going out on the field, and you're sitting there and you're just thinking, and it's
oh my God.
And so she tells him, well, you can do at least one good thing: watch my cakes. They're in the fire. If you're sitting there, at least just take them out at the right moment.
Oh my God.
And so Alfred says, yes, of course, good woman, I will of course look after your cakes. And so she goes off and, of course, has 101 things to do, leaves him there, and there he is. And then suddenly, while watching these cakes, he dreams of the victory that will bring England back, and he works out the entire plan of how it's going to happen and how he can beat the Vikings and get back into Wessex, and everything's going to be successful. And then he wakes up with being clanged over the head by the house going, the cakes, what the fuck have you been doing?
No, sorry, as soon as you started telling us, I'm like, he did not dream of victory, Mingma. He had a little nap, and then he was like, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I had a dream about how I was going to defeat the Vikings. I was really important. I'm so sorry. That's why your cakes are burnt. That's what happened. It's an excuse.
I know, literally, though. It's the worst excuse ever. Like, yeah, what? And then she finds out he's the King of England and goes, oh, I just hit you over the head with a pan. Oops.
That's true. I love that though.
Yeah, so that's the story of the cakes. With more swearing than you normally find in the fairy tales. Anyway, Alfred managed this extraordinary success that from nothing he rebuilt, and he drove the Vikings out of Wessex. But as he did so, he formed a treaty, which created the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale of Settlement is this swathe of land from kind of modern-day Northumbria, cleaving the north all the way down to stopping roughly around East Anglia.
So he just sort of split in two.
A kind of diagonal line across northern England, and said everything to the right of that line is yours.
So when we talk about the north-south divide then, we're actually kind of also, we're talking about a historic east-west divide.
Which actually I suppose is probably still there a little. I mean, neither of us are from the north, so we can't comment on it.
We're very firmly southerners.
Yeah. I mean, I'm country bumping southerner, I'm from southwest.
Yeah, and I'm like London, so I have
so hated by everyone. Yep.
I don't even have a, it's just London. It's not even London. It's London.
It's London. What can we say? Yes, I would agree, but I also think that a lot of this idea of the cultural difference of north and south does come from this time, because even though there was this line across the north, trade still happened. York was a Viking town for 200 years.
So they still would have mingled, but also very much so with the idea that we're not the same, we're different. You're Vikings, we're not Vikings.
There's actually a wonderful story of a soldier who comes from this really, really rural northwest village in World War II. And he was kind of constantly teased for his accent and for this and that. And he's, for some reason, stationed in Iceland for one part of the war. And there's enormous problems because no one can speak Icelandic. And it turns out within 2 weeks he can converse with the Icelandics in Icelandic, because his accent is still so similar to the Old Norse.
That's a really lovely story, actually. But it does highlight a point that, it's kind of, we forget just how interconnected everything is. That's the word I'm looking for. It's not just, Northerners are not just a Northern accent. It's a Northern accent because, or it's, a Northumbrian accent because it comes from this specific thing, or it's, it's not just a Northern accent. It's connected to all these other parts of Europe and the world.
I think we do forget just how much history is in every single inch of this country. And it's I love the UK for this. But the fact just layers upon layers of generations and stories and people and different different cultures constantly coming from different areas, and how every single one informs today. And that's just beautiful in its own way.
I agree with you.
Anyway,
let's come back from wandering at the amazement of the world.
I don't think we quite understand just how extraordinary this idea of exploration was for them. And this search for a new place to call home, a new place for settlement, along with all the kind of bloodthirsty, axe-wielding, berserker stuff.
Stab, stab.
Stabby.
Without getting too Moana about this, but what do you think caused this need to discover and a need to kind of travel and explore and be a wayfarer?
Well, the greatest need was that Scandinavia was a shitty place to live at this point.
Right.
Completely opposite of nowadays, just to point out. But the climate was... The climate was terrible. It was incredibly hard to grow any kind of crops. Very, very long winters. In the dark, in the cold.
Right.
Also, the population was growing. And so once your brother takes over as clan leader of this area, or as king, what happens to the second son? How do you gain your reputation? How do you prove your mettle? Dying in battle was not a tragedy. If you died in battle, you would join Odin in his hall. And so this whole concept of victory and war, they would look forward to it. And if they died on battle, that just didn't matter.
They'd ascend. It was okay.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's one reason just why it'd be so terrifying to meet them in battle, because these guys didn't care if they died.
When you don't kind of not value your own life, but when you're not fixed on life or death, it's that fearlessness. You just go in and you're like, come at me, bro, but in a mega form.
Yeah, Come at me.
In the ye old come at me, bro.
I love that. Yeah. That being said, sadly for me, because I want to talk far more about pagan Vikings, but once they started settling, especially in the UK and these kind of places, Vikings assimilated very, very fast. And a good example of this is Normandy, which is the land of Northmen. William the Conqueror, when he comes over and beats up another Viking kingdom, which is England at this point, he's only 3 generations away from being a Viking who settled in Normandy. But that's 150 years, and they've lost their language, they've lost their old religion, because they entirely assimilated into this Norman French idea.
I see. So does that also contribute to like the rise of Christianity then? If you've got all these kind of Vikings looking for a sense of community and then very easily converting.
There's definitely, they have their own influence on Christianity, which we'll come to, which is quite exciting.
Okay.
But it's an interesting point. I think my grandfather was a Russian immigrant, or Russian refugee, more specifically, from the Russian Revolution. He always said, never underestimate the insecurity of the emigre. You could love your new country so much, and you will be as proud as possible, and you will completely assimilate. You'll probably be more British, to use this kind of example, than someone born in Britain, because you're grateful for the place, all the rest of it, but there is still this constant insecurity of being chucked out, and the fact that you have once been violently displaced from where you called home, there's always the thing that it could be there again. So I could definitely see them kind of absolutely cling to this new culture, because the last thing I want is to go back to starving in Scandinavia.
They kind of want to go, look, we take it seriously, we're the same, we're like you, and then
again, it doesn't fit
sad.
with the normal idea of the bloodthirsty berserkers, does it?
Taking it over, no, it doesn't. It's kind of a bit more sort of small child needy, like, please include me.
They just wanted to be wanted.
They had big knives, but they just wanted to be included. Moving on to origins. This is the section where we discuss the origins of the theatre style. So we trace its beginnings and what influenced its development. So this includes kind of stuff going on in other countries, which I guess is particularly relevant for this topic since we're talking about people coming from Scandinavia and being in Europe.
Viking storytelling is a craft. It is complex and difficult, and I'm still not entirely sure.
You're going to give it a good go.
Oh, you're going to hear me mispronounce so much in this. Okay.
I'm so pleased.
You're getting your own back after the Romans. A lot of their poetry was, of course, based in their myths. Stories, and a lot of the poetry was written down in kind of the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries in Iceland. Okay. When I'm using examples, I try to take ones which are absolutely of the time. But we also know that most of the language was locked by this point, so it would have just been told and told again. So even though it's repetitions,
I see,
they would have told them hundreds of years beforehand. So myths, Yay! Of course, we've got the Norse gods. We've got Odin, we've got Thor, we've got Loki, we've got dwarves, we've got giants, we've got Yggdrasil, the world tree.
I thought you said Idris Elba, and I was like, what?
Now that is an image I want to see. He is the founder, he is the world, Idris Elba.
Anyway, we don't have Idris Elba, but we do have Thor and Loki and all the others.
Yggdrasil, which is the world tree.
Yggdrasil.
In Viking stories, there's one tree on which all of the worlds and all of the realms lived. Earth, our plane, is only one of them. There's the land of giants, there's the land of dwarves, there's the land of gods. And the world tree is circled by, I can't remember the name of the snake, but it's the snake who's eating his own tail. Do you know that kind of like the Ouroboros? Yeah. Another origin is the Greeks, shockingly.
The Greeks just pop up everywhere, don't they?
I'm going to mention this guy a lot. His name is Snorri. Or Snorri.
Snorri, how do you spell that?
S-N for Nigel, O-R-R-I.
Oh, okay.
He was effectively the Brothers Grimm for the Viking stories.
Okay.
He compiled and he edited them and got them all together. And that was in the 14th century in Iceland. So you hear quite a lot of Snorri's sagas. And one thing which comes apparent in some of his sagas, that people are trying to trace their lineage back to the Greeks via the Trojans. So you mentioned in the Romans episode that the Romans invented their own little history where they're actually founded by Aeneas, who does The Vikings were trying it as well. They also were a boat from the Trojan refugees who went up and created
Why is everyone obsessed with being related to Greek people?
I've no idea. What is this?
They just all were like, we're all Greek.
The final thing is they also, which proved this kind of Greek thing, is they tried to fit their gods into a Parthenon, similar to the Greeks' idea. almost like the Romans did as well. So suddenly they started talking about Odin being like the king of the gods and that Thor was his son, and beginning to try and do similarities of X, Y, and Z.
I see.
The final thing, which is a bit more technical, is that there is clear evidence of some of their styles of speaking and some of the poetry being directly influenced by German poetry and Frankish poetry.
Oh, okay.
So that's the final thing, where as they developed their own system of how meters and this kind of stuff work, they clearly were having some conversations with poets in Europe.
Moving on then to what the theatre style actually is. So these are the main features of the theatre style itself.
So in the Viking hall in the middle of winter, much pleasure depended on the spoken word. You know, everyone's a bit drunk, everyone's having a party, and people made and recited poetry, they swapped verses, they sometimes competed in scurrility.
What's, sorry, what?
Wordplay.
They competed in?
Wordplay.
Okay.
Or as my mum calls it, doggerel. Is it embarrassing to admit I have a doggerel box in my room?
I mean, I don't actually know what a doggerel box is. What is it? What is it?
Basically, doggerel is, well, yeah, wordplay. It's just like stupid verses. And I sometimes have a moment when a verse comes into my head and I write it down and it needs to go somewhere. So I have a doggerel box in my room.
Is that also what you put at the beginning of these podcasts?
Yeah, but I might have convinced you just to let me kind of make something up at the beginning. That's why we have a very weird, let me tell you a story, because I need to put my word vomit somewhere.
You need to take them out of the box.
Yeah.
This whole podcast is just like a cover front for you having a way to get these verses of doggerel out. You're like, let's do a podcast so I can tell you.
So I can just do 4 lines of just at the beginning.
Yeah, just for these 4 lines.
You found me out, Liv. This is the entire reason for everything.
I think that's the most economic, cost-effective, time-effective way of filling that need.
Naturally. Vikings of an eve would ask riddles and make comparisons between men, and I love this idea of kind of like, I almost imagine it like a rap battle.
Shots were being fired left, right,
Oh
centre.
yeah, boy. They made up stories, they repeated old ones, and as they became more Christianized, they read aloud from books. Old Norse is written in runes, because runes are very easy to carve into stone and this kind of stuff, but because the word of God is so important in Christianity, that's when publishing and books and this whole idea of passing away and people reading became a big thing. Basically, Norse poetry is conventionally divided into 2 kinds. One is called Edaic, and the other is Skaldic. So let's just have a quick buzz through Edaic first.
Okay.
So this one gets its name from Edda, which is the title of a 13th century handbook of poetics by Snorri Sturluson. There we go.
Nicely done.
We're going to have so much fun with this. So yeah, there's Snorri for you again. But in the 17th century, the term began to apply to the Icelandic codex, in which most of this type of poetry was preserved. Like the Vikings, it's a classic kind of misnomer of like one name ending up meaning something else.
So because this guy, Snorri, kind of recorded all of them, they ended up all being named after him.
Yeah, they ended up being called the Snorri Sagas, which feels a bit shit. You know, he didn't exactly write them all. Well, actually, that's a point, that the Edaic verse is always anonymous and is composed in relatively simple language and meters. So
okay.
the Edaic verse is where we see the themes of the gods and the kings and the this and the that, and the themes are mythological or drawn from heroic legends. Some are coming from more modern ideas and some are purely Norse, in kind of what we consider as like real Norse mythology. So that's Edaic. Skaldic verse is different.
Yay! Thank goodness for that.
So Skaldic as a word is derived from skald, which means poet. It often implies a kind of professional status, like the professional fool in Shakespeare. And in about kind of like 965, there's a reference to a king's treatment of his skalds, which he kept in service. Which shows us again this thing of, oh, well, the skalds are definitely a category of person, like blacksmith or like...
I think that's quite... The idea of a skald, I think, is quite similar to the idea of, in the previous episode, where we talked about like Scots and people attached to things. It's the same sort of kind of poets who were attached to people.
Yes, it is exactly that kind of thing. Skaldic poets, unlike the Edaic verses, aren't usually attributed to named poets, and many of them are in praise of named princes. So basically, if you're a rich bloke, you get a skald in, he writes your kind of worshipful story, and then it gets sung by everyone. That's what you do if you're successful.
Yay!
Canute, back to this boy, had a skaldic poem written about him.
Oh, do we know? Did it survive? Do we know what it's?
It has survived. We've got a little bit more of it coming up.
Oh, okay. I won't get you to recite it then.
Skaldic diction is much richer and remoter from everyday speech than that of Edaic verse.
Okay, so Edaic is like modern poetry, and Skaldic is like Shakespearean.
Little
stuff.
Yes. It's a bit more like casual chat with friends, and then you have to meet the queen. If you're speaking in Skaldic, you are speaking in riddles.
Okay, so it's not something you do casually at all.
No, it's very, very kind of structured. Edaic is the older, and then at a certain point, people decide, right, we want to become myths as well, so we're just going to get this bloke in, and he's going to write this story. And
just get a bit grander, get a bit more...
Yeah.
In
it. Skalds almost certainly would have done both. They would write, but they would also know all the stories, so that if you're in your Lord's Hall and he says, oh, can we hear the story of so-and-so, you would do it.
I see.
There doesn't seem to have been any difference of profession or like a rivalry or anything like that.
The kind of like jack of all trades type thing.
Yeah. So, like the professional fool, you'd be expected to be able to come up with the verses very quickly, but equally you should know all the old stories because you're the TV screen, basically. This is the moment where I'm going to try and quickly run through this, but it's going to be exciting, which is where I try and describe Norse meter.
Okay.
Which is fun. And it's going to be difficult to describe because A, I only just understand it, and B, translation is a thing, and it's difficult.
You're not going to do it in the original Norse, Mingma?
Oh, you just watch me try. And I am actually going to try, and it's going to be completely butchered, and I apologise to any ancient Vikings who are out there right now in advance.
They're all going to come down on you with their great big weapons. Yeah. So, Mingma, before we move on to this, I think we should probably clarify what meter is, because I associate meter with iambic pentameter, so like in Shakespeare time, and the five and the pent in the five, and so. But what actually is meter? Meter
is basically means it's the heartbeat of poetry, and iambic pentameter is the most obvious, and in that iam pentameter does make a heartbeat. So iam means short long, ba bum ba bum ba bum, and pentameter means five in a line. So Shakespeare's ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum, which is quite literally our living heartbeat, which is why it kind of feels so good to hear Shakespeare in a way. But meter means it's just the pulse. Like in music, you have kind of like a rhythm, or you have a certain thing which is going. A very good example for a different kind of meter is W.H. Auden's Night Mail poem, which is meant to sound like a train. And so his meter is, this is the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order. Meter in poetry is just finding that beat. There are roughly 5 different meters in Norse verse. Though do remember, of course, that everyone breaks the rules. It's all very good for academics to say there's this, that, and t'other. But is it actually like that? Who knows? All the rest. Anyway, I'm going to kind of go through these because hopefully that will work better. And why did I make fun of you and Roman's pronunciation?
I'm looking at, I'm thinking about these words. I'm thinking, there's no way Mimba can do this. You thought Caligula was hard.
Oh, you did it! Woo!
I know what the word. I know the word was. I just wasn't associating the word I knew with the word on the page.
Fair enough. All right, okay. Whew! All right, deep breath, and here we go. So, first meter style is called Fornigslag. No, Fornidslag. Fornidslag. Is that how we do it? I don't know. Which is the meter of the ancient world.
Okay.
And it can be both with and without a set number of beats. So the pentameter bit, it doesn't have to have a set number in a line. And actually, unlike iambic pentameter, it normally has 4 syllables, not beats, syllables. Okay. So it's very, very short per line.
So it's like 4 I am Mingma.
I am Yes, exactly.
Just hire me now if anyone's putting on any Norse productions.
We're going for it. Perfect. All right. Oh God, here we go. Okay, so I'm going to try and read some ancient Norse, and I'm so sorry, but I'm hoping to at least try and get some of the beat across. Jord fant Eva ne upp fil himmen, gap va ginuga e gras hilvige, which in English is roughly earth was never nor up heaven, ginung gap was then but grass nowhere. This is a translation of a runic inscription that was found in northern England roughly around 850.
Mingma, what does Gunun Gap mean? I think that's the elephant in the room here. I got all the other words: earth, heaven, grass.
Well, I don't really know. Whoops.
Okay.
So it's definitely a kenning, which is a kind of a mesh of two things. I think Ginung Gap. I think Ginung was some kind of place name, but again, we don't necessarily always know. With these translations, by the way, it's kind of sort of following alliteration and verse movement of the original North, but in kind of adequate English. Because we can't... These rhymes were so tight and mathematical, it is impossible to translate them to show exactly how beautiful they were in the original with understanding. So that is Fornil Gislag.
Woo!
I'm getting there. I mean, I have no idea if that's right, but yeah, here we go. Next style out of the 5 is called Malahatir, with a kind of T, double T,
How
on the end.
many T's has that got?
It's got 2 T's and an R, and I'm rolling it for no apparent reason.
Ooh.
And this was a weightier version of Fornil Dislag, and is known as the meter of speeches. I assume that means that there's more stresses, if that's possible, in 4 syllables, but you know, moving on swiftly. Unlike Fornil Dislag, Malahatir always has a regular number of syllables in a line.
You got this.
Glad near orholda og hitva skalda, viga vrestrone nel vaskra srevda, grendur bezerkir, gonal pil insinum, injul ulchedna ud silu do. I've no idea.
You sounded so Game of Thrones there. I loved it. It was like, I was like, oh, Mingma sounds completely like she's about to
Dothraki.
be on the Dothraki. Yeah, that's what I was going with.
I love it.
So what does that mean then? What does that mean?
So before we, the one thing to point out is that a berserker's in there, if you heard it.
Oh.
Gendru berserker, warrior, which is the one word which kind of like, oh, I know that one. It works.
I know that one.
So the translation, as far as we can get, is full they were of fighters and flashing buckler, western war lancers and wound blades Frankish. Cried then the bare-pelted carnage they had thoughts of, wailed then the wool-coated and weapons brandished.
So, quite a light poem.
Yeah. I mean, all of these are bloodthirsty and war, and also a lot of the poems we have left are from gravestones. So it will be the warrior's story. So do remember that as well. But again, you begin to feel this kind of wailed then the wool-coated and weapons brandished. You began to feel the meter. It's different. It's a different one to Shakespeare, but it's there. Now we're on to Krivju Khatir and Drut Kviet.
So many T's.
Which are 2 different styles, and they, unlike the other 2 styles, always have a rigid, regular number of syllables and are never used in a diac verse. So this is entirely for the princes who were saying, "Oi, mate, I want my own poem, thanks.
Give me a special syllable style.
I'll pay extra."
I want my special one.
Krivju Khatir is a development of Fornil Dislag, which seems to be like the root one, and then all of these, as time went on, got more expressive and this kind of stuff. But the difference is, rather than just having 4 syllables, every other line has 3. So you end up with a kind of 7-syllable phrase, so it's slightly off. But this does create this wonderful kind of deliberate emphasis that makes you believe the poet is totally in command. So it sounds like kind of like he's enforcing both world and matter, and just boom, boom in the form. Bjør elaf unniper, Hans God's mad grunda sena, Han of Getir of good stilflon, ar ok friok, ulum monumum.
I definitely had some God in there, I think.
There's a weird dash over the D's, and I'm not sure if I'm meant to pronounce them differently, and I have no idea, but hey, we're doing
it.
The English translation is roughly, pray Olaf, he unto you, he's God's man, grants his country, now he gets, from God truly, bounty, peace, blessed for mankind.
Oh. That's nice.
Which is sweet.
Yeah.
Slightly less bloodthirsty. We can put that in. And finally, we come on to the real kind of arseholery form of meter, which is the Rotkiet, which is quite literally nicknamed the lordly meter because it's fit only to describe the king and his knights.
So if you use this meter to describe, I don't know, your best mate, you couldn't.
I'd like to imagine there's some kind of Monty Python patrol force out there trying to make sure, no, that you're using this meter for the wrong thing.
For sure. Just call them up, Mingma. Say, excuse me, you missed one.
Yes, FYI. Geweer of cum herasa, hier a land gotna, fiskier or fianda kim svin ande, folgel i fianda lio galandi. And the prose translation would be, the tree of thrud of hostilities, the man whom the greatest virtues accompanied, most men knew that, lies buried in this mound. A more upright chariot verdure of wondrous wide ground of Endel will not rule. Strife strong, land in Denmark.
I mean, I got Denmark, and I think Endel's actually featured in Lord of the Rings, isn't it?
It sounds very close to Gondor, I think. Or I think there is there an Endor? I'm not sure. But fun fact, J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor of Norse poetry. Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic was his literature.
I mean, that's impressive, but also then it makes Lord of the Rings not quite as impressive.
I think there's kind of a quite sweet side of Tolkien. I want to talk about this in a later episode, but when the Normans came in, they wiped out literally all of our culture, which is one reason why in the Dark Ages, and also why you struggled so much with the episode last week, was that they brutally destroyed most of the culture which was in Britain beforehand. And so we lost our myths. And so Tolkien talked about the fact that he wanted to give England a myth, which was what Lord of the Rings was.
Oh.
He wanted to give some kind of real old feeling and stories and this kind of stuff to the country again.
That makes me quite emotional. I'm like, oh, thanks, Tolkien.
Yeah. It's really, yeah.
It's very sweet. And to be honest, I think he succeeded. I think we all love Lord of the Rings. And
yeah. But it also explains why he has all the other books, like the Silmarillion and all the other ones, because it's again about this trying to bring this enormous, literal, let's give this country a myth, and again.
Oh.
On to the final boy, which is, oh god, L and J. How the hell? I've just realised I've got Swedish cousins. They're gonna, if I can't tell them I'm doing this podcast, they're going to crucify me.
Why didn't you call them up and say, hello?
I probably should have, to be honest. Hjolda Hatter is a meter of chants and may well have developed out of magic ritual or cult activities.
Okay, that's a bit different.
Yeah, it sounds a bit, it's an interesting way of putting it. It's normally a pair of A and B lines, like in Fornaldis, I was doing so well, Fornirdislag, followed by a full line of its own stresses. So like 4 syllables of, which are reasonably similar, followed by a much longer line. Here's another gravestone, because we're a very positive podcast here, which comes from roughly 700 in Norway. Folgen ligger hins filugo, fleste visi pat mestar, dedil dolga prudab drauga I pemis haugi. Munat red vidir rada rodskir I Danmarku, endils jalmun grundar, ogaradari landi. Which translates roughly as whom came war god hither to the land of men, as fish from the torrent of enemies swimming, a bird against troop of enemies screaming.
Oh, that's nice.
And not yeah. I'm not intending to put cult and Buddhism together, because it's absolutely not. But Buddhist monks in particular, meditation, they use things like Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, because it helps turn a certain part of the brain off, so that you can then get into meditation, into thinking. And similarly, actually, with the rosary, in Catholicism, that you would go round and round your beads, counting your rosary, and because it's a mechanical motion while you're saying your words, you turn your intellectual brain off. Cleodda Hatter would have been a similar thing, that it was meant to be this kind of pulsing rhythm, so that you could get into a different headgear. So there we go, 5 versions, completely butchered by me, of Norse poetry.
I liked them. Yeah. I enjoyed them. I thought they were great. God.
Anyway, okay, so tiny little extra trivia on the style. A half rhyme in Norse poetry is called skothending, or glancing hit, while a full rhyme is an adelhending, or a main hit.
Okay.
And I love that, because can you just imagine kind of like the blokes with swords who are inside, drunk, can't hold the sword, and so they go, oh, a hit with my insult, ha-ha, ha-ha.
I'm surprised I can't imagine them having particularly bitter sounding insults if they were that drunk, though.
No, probably not, but still, I like that, a hit, a verifiable hit.
10 points to me.
Yeah. Verse making was considered iprot, a skilled feat. And poets would call themselves craftsmen, which is called smidir, which sounds an awful lot like smith, which brings a whole new idea to wordsmith nowadays, I think. So, 3 main groups of stories, really. In Edaic poetry, there is the stories about gods, there are the stories about heroes, and then in Skaldic verse, there is just...
whatever you want it to be.
Whatever the fuck Skaldic verse is. Yeah, quite. So in Edaic myth, we'd see characters who appear who are chiefly gods and associated with otherworldly beings and giants and dwarfs, and this is where we hear the stories of the myths of Odin and of Thor and of Loki. They are proper narrative poems and quite often have a frame and introduction, but a monologue and a dialogue as their main constituent. So that sounds a heck of a lot like a play, to point out. And some of these are actually little plays. But there's no evidence to substantiate that they have been performed as ritual drama. But then again, what is drama? Because again, I could fully see if you take 2 people who are saying the duologue of these lines, that's a play, that's theatre.
No, I accept that.
I will stake my claim on that. They are quite often fables, these kind of poems. So again, you tell the story and then you'd hear the fable of it. So like you quite often find out, well, what's the message behind this story? Like any story, you have a point which you want to get across with the story at the end. So here's an example of one, which is called Vafprum nonismal. I am sorry. In which Odin contends in knowledge with a wise giant. Premise is that the giant will die if he cannot answer any question of Odin.
That sounds a bit extreme.
Another is when Thor asks questions for a dwarf and keeps him talking until sunrise, which turns him into a rock. Also, remember, if we're going back to Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, the trolls who kind of turn to stone. Also, what's quite nice is Thor learns a lot of diction, which I think is quite funny, because I always think of Thor as a bit of a thug, but here we go. It's also, in this poem in particular, you get some impression of the Norsemen's awareness of the world of nature. They would have been so much closer to the elements than we are now. The sky is called things like Windweaver, Upworld, the lovely roof, the dripping hall.
That's nice.
The sun is ever-glowing, the bright wheel, the all-sheer. Night is the shadow mask, the obscure, the sleep fun, and dream goddess. Edaic heroic, which is the next style. The heroes of the past mixed historically with fiction very happily. So again, this thing of...
the truth is not the
talking
truth.
about your granddad, but also he married the daughter of a dwarf or a giant or a Valkyrie. Here's one kind of example of a story for the heroic side, which is the story of Volund. And unlike a lot of our stories, Volund was a smith. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a prince. Smith Volund was known for forging gold rings. And King Nidad stole one, gave it to his daughter, and imprisoned Volund to make him work only for him. In revenge, Volund bided his time and made the king's sons' heads into silver drinking vessels.
Okay.
Gave them to the king,
really cheerful.
And then raped his daughter so she would bear his child. He then turned into a bird and flew away, revenge complete. Nice and, cheerful hero story. I'm not quite sure what as you were saying, what's the moral there? It's a bit interesting.
Yeah, and how he turned the heads into silver drinking vessels is kind of very quickly skimmed over.
Finally, Skaldic poetry. Great men got skalds to write their histories, as we said. Canute the Great got his own Skaldic poem, which is called Knutsdrapa by Otter the Black. As far as I can tell, the Edaic style deals with what we traditionally think of as Viking culture, while Skaldic is very much written at the time. Okay. There's also a final little thing about Edaic poetry we need to mention because it feeds into legacy later on, which is there seems to be this weird theme of Edaic poetry and opening graves.
I was going to say, so what do you mean by opening graves? Like digging up bodies?
Pretty much, yeah. There seems to be a thing of heroes going into these graves to get stuff, basically. And it seems like a motif for storytelling which is unique and characteristic to Old Norse texts. It's possible to identify 2 motives for the reopening of graves: to gain esoteric knowledge and knowledge of the family and lineage, and to get hold of specific objects.
So, now we move on to scoring. Every episode, we score each theatre style in 4 separate categories: sleight of hand, scandal, ripple or riot, and legacy. We give each a score out of 10 for each category, leading to a max total of 80. Finally, we decide whether it deserves to enter the esteemed House of Revels. So, the first category that we are going to score the Viking storytelling theatre style in is sleight of hand. So sleight of hand is where we explore the stagecraft in this theatre style, the props, the tricks, and the trapdoors. So Mingma, do you want to tell us a bit about the theatre style?
The theatre style.
The theatre style!
All right. Yes, so normal problem with these early episodes that it's about kind of 10% evidence and 90% conjecture. So, let's make it up as we go along. It's great. Anyway, so there is a bit for sleight of hand, surprisingly. First thing is music. We know almost nothing about Norse music apart from the fact it existed, which is a bit sad.
I mean, it's nice that it happened, but it's just a big question mark then.
Yeah. One nice thing is that, contrary to all these kind of big butch stereotypes of all the kind of berserker men of Viking times, the harp was considered a real gentlemanly instrument and would be considered a fitting accomplishment for a great lord.
Oh. So were the warriors and the soldiers also harp players, or was it that you were a harpist?
No. So it was like the idea of the kind of Jane Austen accomplished lady, where you would be a well-read and you would play something, all the rest of it. If you're a gentleman or a lord, being able to play an instrument was something very well respected. 3 men who we know were able to play the harp in the 12th century was a Norwegian king, an Orkney earl, and an Icelandic bishop.
Sounds like the beginning of a joke.
Oh gosh. They all walk into a bar
and they all start playing the harp.
Ooh. That feels like that scene in Tangled where she walks into the bar.
Oh yeah, and then he's like, I'm vicious, mean and scary.
Yeah.
So was it just the harp, or were there any other instruments that were played?
So we know that a form of fiddles and pipes were also used. And the other point, which is less the instrument, but what they do with the instruments, not a euphemism, was dancing. We're almost certain that it existed. One quite cute thing is it's very likely it was a form of courting, that you would sing while your mate was playing the instrument, and you would dance around the woman as you're kind of courting.
Oh.
Which I think. And you know the How to Train Your Dragon?
Yes.
You know this the song in the second one of my dearest one, my darling dear, your mountain words astound me.
No, I don't, but I enjoyed that.
Words. In the great and esteemed and historically accurate How to Train Your Dragon 2, the Viking father sings to his wife. Mm-hmm. And I just have this feeling that they probably did do the research on this, and this was something of a similar ilk, which I think is quite sweet.
I also like the idea that it's like, you just said it to me, that you have your mate on the harp and then you're singing to the woman that you love, or you're dancing to the woman with the woman you love, and it's like the best wingman ever. Like, what happened? It's like, yeah. Mate, can you just play this song on the harp while I like dance with this woman? Thank you very much.
This is so true. Also, Liv, great turn of phrase. Wingman, harp.
Oh, that makes
angel
sense. Okay, so would they have music for sure then?
The other thing is props. So, every good theatre needs its props and this kind of stuff. As we've already mentioned earlier, the Vikings loved a good old-fashioned grave robbing.
Oh.
And this is total conjecture, but I could well imagine the storyteller who comes into the nearest town and says, oh, this was Ragnar's sword. Look at the hilt. This says this, What a way to ground your stories. I think that's very likely. Can I talk about magic combs?
What? Please do.
Oh, again, much of this is speculation, but a number of Viking combs have survived to the present day, and a lot of them have a hollow chamber in the handle.
Okay.
So it's been speculated that this hollow chamber was designed to hold kind of some object or substance, like a secret compartment.
Okay.
Actually, in the Song of Roland, which is a 12th century poem, there's a reference to the relics of a Saint Denick hidden in the hilt of an ostentatious sword. So there's clearly some kind of thing about kind of hiding things within objects.
Yeah, they've definitely got this relationship with objects, the Vikings, don't they?
I can imagine, like, in everyday use, this little kind of hole or, compartment might be used to kind of put herbs or to make a poultice or an amulet. But I would argue, I would stake my claim that the storyteller who knows his salt would see this as a perfect secret compartment. Stash a bit of powder in there and at the right moment, throw it on the fire and make the flames turn green or purple, just as you're talking about the dragon or this kind of thing.
You're talking about this, and I can imagine it. But also, as soon as you said compartment, I was like, drugs. It's a drugs thing. It's all about drugs. They're carrying around their little stashes of.
This is also true.
What do you mean? There were drugs?
Well, yeah. Well, now you mention them. Yes, drugs. Drugs are a thing in Viking times as well.
Okay, I was not.
So that was a great segue. Congrats, Liv.
I didn't even know I was doing that. I was just like, it's a compartment of drugs. It's a compartment of drugs. But now I'm right. There were drugs. So
yes, drugs being my third kind of big category. There's evidence that the famous Berserker rage, so the Vikings who went berserk, the Berserkers, was induced by mushrooms.
Right? Mm-hmm. I mean,
you get on the shrooms and you become a berserker. It's
really
great.
Enraged and go and kill some people.
Sounds ideal. And to be honest, I don't think anyone would like to meet a Viking tripping balls on the battlefield, do you?
Yeah, completely stoned and carrying a massive axe and being like, I'm going to... And also not afraid to die. I mean, it's a horrible combo of like, I don't care about my own life. I'm high and I've got a massive weapon.
I'm high and I'm mad.
Basically, yeah. Oh.
But there's another kind of drug, which is the seeds of the... God, the words in this episode. Hyoscyamus niger, which is a plant related to the potato.
The potato?
The potato. Potatoes have wondrous things involved with them. I don't know what this accent is, but I'm just going to go.
No, stop. I don't know what it is. I don't know. I mean, we're doing the drug section, and I'm starting to wonder if you've taken something before this episode.
I've sampled the product. Oh,
I've had too many potatoes.
Who knows? Yeah. So it's related to the potato, but also related to deadly nightshade.
Okay. That's all right then, isn't it?
The seeds of this plant, which I'm not going to pronounce again, were found in the grave of a high-status woman in Fjerkat in Denmark, alongside ointment and a staff. And current popular belief is that this might indicate she was a volva, which means seeress. This drug, these seeds, in large quantities it's deadly, but in small it makes you hallucinate.
Oh, okay.
Neither of these are obvious examples of drugs being used in theatre, but it does show that there's a tendency for Vikings to use drugs to alter their state of mind. It's clearly part of culture. Again, I'm conjecturing here, but these stories and poems were told after feasts. And so, is it so unlikely someone slipped something into the communal wine to make the story that much more realistic?
Yeah, and I also think it probably also adds the atmosphere. If you're telling a story to a group of people who are probably drunk and maybe on some sort of shrooms, that's gonna affect the theatre style for sure.
So yes, my sleight of hand is the music, the courting with harps.
I like that.
With the kind of top wingmans. Magic combs and shrooms.
Right, so you do have lots of components then that we know existed, even if there is some conjecture in there, so it's not...
I mean, the difficulty with it is, again, it's conjecture, and it's not that it's traditional stagecraft in terms of machinery of gods coming down from the ceiling.
Yay.
Or trapdoors or anything like that. But... I don't know. I think there's an interesting thing about if they did use hallucinogenics in storytelling. I mean, that's scenery, I guess. You wouldn't necessarily guarantee that everyone was seeing the same thing.
I like that. Yeah, guys, look at the scenery. Have these mushrooms. So I'm feeling maybe then like a 7.
Yeah. I think it's also difficult with these early ones. 'Cause you're like, you don't want to go too high too soon.
Yeah.
But I think this is definitely the best we've had for Sleight of Hand so far. Yeah, I think I'll say That's 7 true. As well.
So a 7 each, so that gives it 14 out of 20 for sleight of hand. Next we move on to scandal, the second category. Was there any juicy gossip surrounding this style, whether on stage or off? So was there any saucy stuff happening with Vikings and storytelling?
Kind of depends on what we're talking by scandal. Is it their standards or is it today's standards?
I don't know. I think we have to do it by today's standards because, I mean, I guess, you know, a woman showing her ankles is quite scandalous and we have to take that into consideration if we're doing Victorian England. Well, but, I mean, what is it? Let's hear, is there anything scandalous?
The problem is that because we're doing it as poetry, which would have been very much more integrated into life than the traditional theatre would be, in quotation marks, a lot of what might be considered scandal in around theatre would just be the way that Vikings lived anyway. Which is boozing, it's drugs, it's rock and roll, it's, you know, shagging in the corner of the feast and, you know, an awful lot of this and that, human sacrifice, all that fun stuff.
So it's quite hard to be scandalous then if you're already pretty...
The one little thing I found, which I think is quite cool, which is very directly related to scandal and the Viking poetry and storytelling, is a story of a skald, so a poet, Egil Skare Grimsson. He composed his head redemption poem in Fornildislag. So remember, that is the meter of the ancient worlds, which is the most common. Okay. It's the one with the 4 syllables.
Right, I'm with you. So the one with the...
That's it, Ginung gap.
Ginung back.
I'm going to look that up at some point because that's quite embarrassing. I don't know. Anyway, so so it's 4 syllables per line, and this skald managed to write this poem entirely in that meter, but in couplets with a 4-fold repetition of rhyme.
Whew.
So that means if it was 2-syllable words, of those 4 syllables, 1 syllable has to always be rhyming throughout the entire poem.
So, like, if it was Mingma Hughes, Christian Pews... Yes.
Well, I think that kind of proves the point. It's Liv Gibbs Fairley stole
That's my whole name.
Some barely yes. I think both of us, it's so hard. And he did an entire poem of that shorter line, and he might swap the rhyme every 4 lines. So he'd have to kind of like come up with 4 different rhymes for that 4 line and make it make sense and make it all kind of work together and make it into something which was considered one of the best achievements of poetry at that time. The reason it's in scandal is because it was such an incredible achievement. It saved his life.
It saved his life?
Yeah. He was on the execution block and he whacked out this poem and they couldn't get rid of him now.
That's quite impressive. It's like, you can't kill me. I'm a genius. Look. Yeah. I mean, what had he been doing before, though? Like, had he just not been writing these amazing poems that they were like, oh...
I don't actually know the whole story of it. It's just, yeah, what on earth had happened that he had, you know, talk about kind of like a deadline.
Yeah, he had this ace up his sleeve that he could have used. So there's not much scandal then, really, apart from this guy, Egil Skare Grimsson.
Well, yes and no. It's again this thing of, by our standards, anyone having sex in the middle of a performance would be highly scandalous.
That's true. But it doesn't feel scandalous. It doesn't feel juicy because it's the norm.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm going to have to give it a 7.
Oh, okay.
What were you thinking?
I was thinking that because it's normal everyday life, it's 6 for the whatever else was going on in Viking culture. But then I'll give it half marks because it's also part of just like a general, it wasn't something specifically for theatre.
So you're going to give it, what, 6.5?
No, so I think I might give it 4.
Okay.
In a very convoluted, probably I can't justify this later way, but 4.
You're going to give it 4 and I'm going to give it a 5, I think.
We're very scientific about these scorings, aren't we?
I know. Okay, so moving on to Ripple or Riot. Mm-hmm. Here we judge whether this style caused a ripple or a riot. How socially controversial was its existence and content? Did it spark wider conversations?
I mean, apart from saving your life by writing a good poem, this was pretty standard, I'm afraid. You know, again, it's this, it was just part of culture. It was the way they told their history in general. So it wasn't like it was particularly politically contentious.
Didn't cause even a small ripple then.
If I'm really pushing for something, we could probably argue that there was this moment when the idea of Viking moved from being a person on an expedition to being a pirate. I'm sure it was the Skalds who kind of helped transition that move in public thinking.
Okay.
But that's a real 0.5, I'd say.
0.5, yeah. I think, for me, by the sounds of it. So 1 out of 20, which feels harsh, but I guess we have to go with what we know. So then, finally, we look at legacy. How has this theatre style influenced the future?
Future of theatre? Well, also just, I put in a few legacy things here of not just theatre, because,
okay,
why not? This particular style hugely influenced the cult of saints' relics, which was a big thing in medieval world. So if a saint became once a saint had been declared a saint, quite often the place of death or where the bones were buried would become a place of worship. So it quite often sprang up very quickly after they had died, and then their place would be pilgrimage sites, and people might buy things to give to the saint, or you'd buy holy water from the shrine of the saint, or it was a whole roaring trade in saints. Okay. And it was actually one of the big things which Martin Luther ended up slamming on the door when he put up his reformations for the Catholic Church, saying, why are we talking about saints when actually we should be talking about the Word of God? It became this huge thing. Historian Patrick Geary points out that yes, I know, I've got sources. Points out that even though the cults of saints may be identified almost everywhere in the medieval Christian world, a particular aspect of it only appeared in the West, which is where the Vikings settled. And that was the worship primarily centred on physical remains and relics of the saints.
They really do love the objects, don't they, yeah. Vikings?
This is why...
They love connection and physical things.
A little bit of bone, a bit of finger, your heart, a bit of hair, any of this kind of worship. And actually, here's a kind of fun did you know that all Catholic churches, even today, need to have a bit of a saint to be consecrated?
Sorry?
So
you need to have a bit of a saint's hair to be...
Or collarbone.
Bone.
Or body, just full-on mummified body. To be fair, it's not just the Catholic Church. There's also Bodhnat, which is the biggest Buddhist temple in Nepal, also has supposedly the collarbone of Buddha. I'm not going to mention that too much because then it disproves my argument.
Okay.
But in the Catholic Church, there was always this problem of supply and demand of saints' Buddha.
I was going to say, surely they need to be making saints left, right, and centre.
Yeah.
And then not killing them, but waiting until they die.
Yes. So there always seems to be this problem of supply and demand. Talk about an economic concept in saints' body parts.
This is so weird, but I love it.
You also just realise just how much black humour there must have been during this time. Because everyone would have seen the funny side as well. Christianity was wonderful always at picking up bits and pieces.
Quite literally.
All right. Of other older religions. As we've already discussed, objects were highly important in Viking religions, and in the Carolingian era.
Is there someone called Carol who I didn't know about? Was there a Carol who
brings a Christmas carol all the way to a different thing, doesn't it? No,
that is true.
It's an empire of a sort. Was roughly kind of France minus Brittany until Charlemagne doubled the size into Germany and northern Italy. It was roughly kind of 751 to 888. I don't know how you're meant to kind of say the dates before 1000.
Yeah, you're like 751. You sound like you're calling out bingo numbers.
Yeah, it does. I was literally saying. I thought bingo. Anyway, some of the kings of this wonderful empire include Louis the Pious and Charles the Fat.
Charles the Fat.
Yeah.
Wow.
You got Canute the Great, and then they got Charles the Fat. In the Carolingian era, saints' relics would appear as agents in written sources. They could own property, they could receive donations, and were acknowledged as the proprietors of the churches in which they were buried.
So they basically treated them like living people?
Literally, yeah. literally like living people in lore. The Vikings were easy and early adopters of Christianity, as we kind of said earlier. They wanted to settle, they wanted to assimilate, and so they would just pick up the religion. But to me, it just seems obvious they brought some of their traditions with them. They absolutely considered certain artifacts to be animated in certain contexts. There seems to have been this correlation of the popularity of the cult of saints, and particularly this kind of saints relics trade, with areas where the Vikings settled. So northern France, which is the Carolingian area, Britain, kind of all the way around, kind of where we think about the kind of coastlines of modern day Scandinavia. All those kind of areas. Even in Christianity, the Vikings needed their heroes. They needed to have these people in their stories, the saints in this case.
That makes sense. So they needed these people.
Again, though Christianity undoubtedly won against every other religion, what did other things influence?
Bring into it that we don't even... Yeah, because we think of Christianity, as I know we talked about it in the last episode, of kind of being this fully formed thing, but I guess that's the kind of the theme of these podcasts, is nothing is one thing completely. It's always been influenced by other things.
Yeah.
So actually quite high for... even though the legacy of Viking storytelling, so to speak, hasn't really influenced, like, we don't all have these 5 different meters now, but the Viking culture had a big influence on culture in general.
Though we don't specifically know the Viking storytelling techniques in chivalric romances, which we are going to do at some point in the future, some of the way they are structured is quite similar to narratives from the Viking Age and from Fornalda sagas.
Oh, okay.
And one example of that, here it comes again, is the opening of graves.
What is it with the graves? Like, just do something different, Hans. Get a new hobby.
The literary models, so like the structure of it, of these stories of reopening mounds and going into tombs and kind of conversing with ghosts, don't seem to exist in any other type of literature, and all seem to stem back to this.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, okay, put it another way, the chivalric times is when the story of Arthur really got canonised. Think about the number of kind of grave robbing and all the rest of it which goes on in that.
That's true. So that's probably influenced that as well.
Yeah, and Excalibur, also this idea of objects, the personification. My final little point on legacy is, we all know about Vikings. It came from somewhere.
Yeah,
if it comes,
we had to have heard about them, and we know quite a lot. So, and also the image that we have of a Viking is relatively then seems quite true, like this kind of rawr, warrior type.
Though we also forget the other side of it, the fact that they were much more amenable to moving on. But it's also stuff like, we wouldn't know about the Norse gods were it not for this Edaic poetry.
That's true.
Not as well, not all these stories. It's all the kind of Norse mythology survived because of these storytelling traditions.
Then in that case, legacy is pretty big then. Pretty huge.
I think it has to be 7. Because I think about how many plays and how many films and how many video games.
I mean, Marvel.
Yeah, Thor.
Yeah. Tom Hiddleston. We wouldn't have Tom Hiddleston without Viking storytelling. Okay, I appreciate Norse mythology, but I think I'm going to give it a 6. So that brings us to a total score of 28 plus 13 equals 41 out of 80.
That's very good. It's above half.
That's above half. We're slowly getting there.
I'm really surprised. I have to admit, this was an entirely new subject for me. And it was interesting just how much more human suddenly Vikings became.
Yeah, when you talk about them like dancing with each other and this idea that they're kind of quite insecure and they're going to these new places and they want to just fit in really hard, well, and actually they're kind of just not escaping Scandinavia, but they're kind of, it's not like we're going to go and take over everywhere. They're just like, we would like to live somewhere else. Maybe just a little bit.
We'd like to survive, please. I always have an image when I think of Vikings of kind of a flame which burns fast and bright and goes out very fast.
Aww.
In a kind of way of just like, I think there's something quite romantic about really living, and then suddenly
you're gone.
Yeah. I don't know.
I guess the big question, Mingma, drawing this all together then, is does Viking storytelling, Viking poetry belong in the House of Revels?
There's something so romantic about it. So atmospheric. even if you just begin to feel the meter of some of this poem, you suddenly get images, just flashes of life, which I think is very exciting. But it's too similar to Fireside, and we put Fireside in because we had to. You kind of had to put in the origin of theatre, but I don't.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure whether it quite makes it.
Yeah. I think they're in Odin's hall. They're not in the House of Revels.
Yeah, they're not in our hall. They're in someone else's nice hall.
Yeah.
They can have a place somewhere else. Okay, that's fair enough though.
What do you feel?
I was leaning towards no, to be honest, as well. I think I've really enjoyed listening to you and learning more about this topic of Vikings, and also I think it's kind of humanized them a bit more, like learning about their syllable stresses and their poetry, and actually that they were very sophisticated, people. But I don't think, if we're going back to theatre and what it's contributed to theatre, it's quite enough.
In theatre, they've given us Marvel, and they've given us grave robbing.
Yeah,
theatre.
That is nice, but there are some great plays that don't involve superheroes or grave robbing. So I think probably then, so it doesn't make it into the House of Revels.
No. Oh, well, they'll be too drunk and high on shrooms to care. It's fine.
Yeah, they won't care. They're having a great time without us. They don't actually need us being there.
No, they don't at all.
They probably just leave as well. They'd be like, we don't want to be here. We're going to go to a new place.
No, we're far too cool for you. Yeah.
I just love the idea of someone stealing their own ancestors' sword or something, and then being like, this isn't my family's, this is someone great.
Poor old Saul will get really pissed off. You can imagine it whacking you around the head the next day.
You'd be like, stop lying.
You what, mate? You're going to carry me around and call me the wrong name? What?
You picked the wrong sword to mess with.
Yeah. Now that's a story I want to hear.